Hi, I'm Molly. It's expected nowadays that all live digital mixing consoles have an internal effects rack for processing audio, but many engineers still find themselves reaching for additional external effects solutions. In light of this, we've introduced the Spice Rack to all Quantum consoles on top of our standard effects rack. You can think of the Spice Rack as our premium effects rack, providing plug-in style native processing to all Quantum consoles. There are currently two Spices to offer: the Chili6, a 6-band multi-band compressor expander, and the NANA6, a 6-band dynamic EQ. Of course, both of these Spices can achieve the same result as other third-party processors, but there are inherent advantages of having the processing inside the console. Lower latency, less interconnect and therefore fewer points of failure, and less kit to carry on the road with you. In this video, we're going to be exploring the Spice Rack, understanding what the Spices do, what the controls are available, and where they might be useful, and then have a listen to them. Before we have a look at the Chili6 and the NANA6 interfaces, let's first familiarise ourselves with the concepts of multiband compression and dynamic EQ. A normal single-band or wide-band compressor reduces the level of the whole signal when the threshold is passed. A multi-band compressor splits the frequency spectrum into a number of bands and provides separate compression controls for each of these bands. In the case of the Chili6, we split the signal into 4 bands. Each band then has its own separate compression controls and is compressed independently. Imagine you want to compress a drum bus. With normal compressor, the whole signal gets compressed when the kick and snare are hit, even the cymbals, which might not need compressing at that point. This can result in undesirable artifacts like pumping of the cymbals. With a multi-band compressor, you could tune one band to the kick drum and another to the cymbals. Now when the kick drum exceeds the threshold, only that band will get compressed and the cymbals won't be affected. Now, what's dynamic EQ? Standard EQ applies a static change to the frequency response, whereas dynamic EQ applies an increasing or decreasing amount of EQ when the signal at the center frequency of the EQ band passes a threshold. This makes it possible to apply different EQ as the signal gets louder or quieter. Let's take the example of a singer. When they get louder and start belting, the tonality of their voice might change compared to their quieter singing voice. With dynamic EQ, you can apply an EQ that complements their quieter singing voice and have this EQ change when they get louder and pass the threshold. It's often misunderstood what the difference is between a multi-band compressor and a dynamic EQ, as they can both be used to achieve similar results. In general, you could consider a multi-band compressor to be more of a shaping or creative tool, whereas dynamic EQ is more of a surgical tool for fixing specific problems. Let's take a look at the controls on the Spice Rack. Down the left-hand side are the processing slots available in the Spice Rack. I'm on a Quantum 338 today, so have access to 8 Spice Rack slots. This number will change as you go up and down the Quantum range. First, let's take a look at the Chili6. In order to adjust parameters, there are 2 options at the top of the panel: touch assigns faders or touch assigns touch turn. When touch turn is selected, touching any of the on-screen controls will assign that single control to the touch turn encoder. When fader control is selected, touching any on-screen control will assign that row of controls to the fader bank underneath the screen. This allows quick control of multiple parameters at once and makes it easy to smoothly ride any values during a show. There's a large visual representation of what the Spice is doing to the sound, which dynamically changes as it processes the audio. The green line represents the EQ curve that's currently being applied to the audio. This green EQ line updates in real time, so you can always see the effect of the process. As you can see, there are 4 flat top filters separated by 3 crossover controls. There is also a crossover slope, which acts like a cue for these bands. On top of the 4 flat top filters available on the Chili 6, there are 2 freely assignable parametric bands. These both have a cue and a frequency control. All 6 bands then have the following controls. Gain is used to set the starting EQ curve that's applied to the signal before it reaches the threshold. Range is the maximum EQ change after the threshold is exceeded. This can be a positive or a negative change. By using a range control instead of a ratio, we have a much more precise control over the maximum EQ change achievable. Unexpected extreme dynamics, which can often occur in live scenarios, could cause massive and undesirable EQ changes if there was no range control. Attack and release control the time it takes for the effect to engage and disengage when passing over the threshold. There is then, of course, the threshold, which is the level the signal must reach in order for the effect to kick in. Along the left are our master controls. Adjusting one of these controls will relatively adjust that parameter for all of the bands. Above here, we have our dynamic angle control. This is how far past the threshold the signal must go before you reach the full range. You can think of it as being a bit like a ratio on a standard compressor. Above that is our release shape control. This is the shape of the curve followed by the effect release. With a value of 0, this is an exponential curve. This is the standard release characteristics of compressor functions. Setting it to 0.5 gives a linear release shape, but what is unique about the spice rack is that going to a value of 1 gives an inverse exponential curve. This means that the decay will move slowly at first, but accelerate its change as it gets closer to the final target level. This means that a much smoother level change can be achieved, even with short release times. There are also sidechain controls available. Press here to select a sidechain source, which can be fed anywhere from the console. Once a sidechain signal has been set, you can choose per band whether you want it to be triggered by the internal signal or the external sidechain signal. The split wide selection then determines whether the signal triggering each band is split to be just the filtered bandwidth for the band, or in wide mode, the whole unfiltered frequency range. The spice rack also offers a range of listen controls. Each band can be listened to with either the on-screen listen buttons or by using the LCD buttons when controls have been assigned to faders. Listen source will determine what you're going to hear, either the band of audio after processing or the sidechain signal triggering the band. When listening, this is sent to the listen destination. This can be either solo 1, solo 2, or a destructive listen. In destructive mode, it will essentially mute all other bands, like a solo in place. Bands can also be bypassed with either the on-screen bypass buttons or the mute buttons when the controls are assigned to faders. There is an output level control, a makeup gain to compensate for any rise or fall in overall level due to processing. Each spice rack slot is mono, but 2 can be linked together by pressing the stereo button at the top of the panel. If you route to the spice rack from a stereo channel, it will link them automatically for you. Finally, at the top of the panel, you can change the type. Let's quickly run through the controls on the NANA6. As you can see, the interface looks very similar, but we have just 6 parametric bands. The only additional controls are the display controls. These allow you to show and hide different parts from the large graphic. Sidechains shows the filter applied to the triggering signal when split is selected. Band gains shows the colour-coded representation of what each band is contributing to the overall EQ. Range shows the range set by the user. The Chili6 and NANA6 are two very versatile tools that can be used for many different applications. One example of a Chili6 is on a vocal channel. You could use the low bands to reduce any proximity effect, the rise in level of low frequency signals when a singer gets closer to a microphone. The higher bands could be used for de-essing. It could be also used for compressing a signal with a wide range of frequencies, like a drum bus or a master bus, while shaping the overall frequency response of the signal. The NANA6 is useful for things like taming excitable frequencies on a bass guitar channel. Some notes may resonate louder than others, so you could apply an EQ that will reduce the frequency when it passes a threshold. Another example is for ducking the bass guitar at the resonant frequency of the kick drum when the kick drum hits. Sidechaining it allows for the kick to cut through the bass guitar if it was masked before. You could also try tuning two bands to the same frequency and setting different attack and release times. This means for drums, for example, you can EQ the transient and the tail differently. This could be boosting the high end with the clicky beta sound and reducing the low end for the initial transient, and then increasing the low end boominess and reducing the high end for the tail. In general, the Chili6 is more of a shaping tool, and we've added some factory presets to give you a starting point. There are no factory presets on the NANA6, as this is more of a tool to fix problems specific to each user scenario. Now let's have a quick listen to them in action. For our first audio example, I've got a vocal loop here. For the purposes of this, I've put no processing on the channel strip itself, so no EQ and no dynamics. And I'm going to insert the Chili6.
Find a way to set me free. Tears don't say no more.
So starting with the default, I'm going to now recall one of the factory presets. So let's go for Chili Vocal Clean.
I know that you're heaven sent. Find a way to set me free. Tears don't say no more. I can see your heaven sent. Break those chains around your feet.
This has given us a great start for starting to tune it to this particular vocal. So it's cleaned it up a lot, taken out the low end, and also taming some of the high end. I've got a loop of floor tom here, and I'm going to apply the NANA6 to it. Let's have a quick listen before I apply it. Notice how you can hear a lot of the resonance of the drum before it's actually been hit. So now I'm going to turn it on, and I've tuned the bands of the NANA to remove the resonances of the drum when it's not being played, so under the threshold. You can hear how it's now taking out those resonances before the drum and after the drum is played. In this video, we've covered the Spice Rack, what it does, where it could be useful, and then some audio examples. Why not try them in your mix next time you're on a DiGiCo Quantum console? And head over to our YouTube channel for more quantum theory videos.